Take what you wanted, suffice to leave.
This time, I want to take a look at the history of my grandpa's old shop. This is where we all used to live. Way back in the 1970s, we lived in the relatively small town of Elyria, Ohio. In a place where the population's about 50,000 people, everywhere is right around the corner. Well, the same's true here. Back then, my grandpa, that guy, James McCaskie, ran an auto repair shop right around the corner, known as Al's Auto Glass. The address is Tannery Street, but more importantly, it's situated right next to the East Bridge where it crosses the Black River. Previous to that, I guess the property was an auto lot. Today, it's a nifty little microbrewery. My wife and I had the pleasure of going there recently, and it's really nice to see the place reinvent itself. Right out behind the building is the Black River. If you kind of walk out halfway across the bridge, you can even see an old dam stretching across the water. It's been there for as long as anyone can remember, but I don't know that anyone knows what it was ever there for. And that's the thing. I wanted to know a little bit more about my grandpa's old shop, that dam, and maybe whatever it powered. So let's go see what we can find. According to the local paper, the walls for the auto shop were laid upon the ruins of an old flour mill that stood here until the 1950s, something called the White Mill. And I guess that structure dates or dated back to the earliest days of Elyria, before there was a Tannery Street or an East Bridge or really any bridge spanning the Black River. Well, looks like we're going back to the very beginnings of the city to figure this one out. Elyria was officially founded in 1817 by a guy named Heman Ely. He and his dad got that land in the sell-off of the Connecticut Western Reserve, which is kind of interesting, but not what we're here for. The history books reciting the founding story, of which there are more than you might think, all agree that Heman came out the year before Elyria was established, I imagine to pick a spot for his new city, and then traveled back to the Cleveland area where he contracted with a company to kind of get things started with a couple of buildings back at his site on the river. This way, when the pioneers make the trip a year later, they have all that waiting for them and they can go right to the business of clearing Main Street and building homes. Included in those first structures was a flour mill powered by a small dam. Eventually, the pioneers will build a bridge just downriver from that dam and kind of right next to the mill. That's interesting, because we know Heman's house was the first one that all the founders got together and built, and it used to sit right here, like a block up the street from the mill. And we know that Heman himself initially owned that land with the dam and the flour mill on it, but ended up building a newer, much larger mill further upriver by the waterfalls. This new one will become known as the Red Mill, and over time, it'll become a bit of an Elyria icon. Alternately, that older and much lesser-known Pioneer Mill, right next to the East Bridge, will have a few names. Here you can see they call it the Eagle Mill. It's apparently also called the East Side Mill for a while, but generally speaking, this mill is known as the White Mill. Not long after this is taken, the miller, he's in the white shirt there by the tree, will sell everything to a couple of guys who will take this whole thing to the next level. Their partnership will be called Elyria Milling Company, and they're going to rebuild that white mill from the ground up. Just look at the differences. They'll also buy the famous Red Mill and do the same thing there, except for some reason they paint it black. Anyway, that location at the top of the falls becomes the new headquarters, and from there, they're going to produce their popular Morning Glory flour. This is in the early 1900s we're talking about, and Elyria Milling Company was doing well enough to have two different operations going at the same time. After a while, someone gets the genius idea to paint the old mill on Lodi back to red, and they begin selling Red Mill flour, which will itself outlast the Elyria Milling Company. Eventually, they focus their energies on what they're doing there at the East Falls, and another company sets up shop in the White Mill. This is the Riverside Milling Company, and they're going to go head-to-head with Elyria Milling, producing their own Crescent and White Mill patent flours. But Elyria Milling is sitting on top of the East Falls, so to capitalize on that, they build a state-of-the-art, well, for its time, hydroelectric generator right there at the bottom of the waterfalls, and change their name to Elyria Milling and Power. In pretty short order, they get awarded the contract by the city to provide electricity to everyone in the area. So they begin putting up poles and stringing lines. This is a postcard of the East Bridge from before all that. See the white mill peeking out from behind the trees? What you don't see are power poles or lines crossing the bridge. This is from just a couple of years later, kind of looking at things from the other direction. And you can clearly see power lines spanning the bridge, and those are power poles. I want to pause to point out that these postcards have an interesting designation on them. This version of the East Bridge was built with a single arch spanning the entire river with a height of something like 23 feet in the middle, making it the flattest single arch bridge in the world when it was built. This is actually the fourth incarnation of this bridge, which would itself last over 100 years. Also worth noting is that most, if not all, of the modern conveniences that we can't live without today haven't really been invented or mass-produced yet, so no one totally understands what it's going to take to provide electricity to the entire area. In fact, it turns out it's going to take way more power than the falls can provide, so by 1912, arrangements are being made for Elyria milling and power customers to have their electricity provided by larger power plants being built nearby. That was in the fall. By spring of the following year, though, getting power to the area is only going to be one problem. Things are only going to get worse, and I mean for everybody throughout the entire Ohio Valley area. This is the end of March we're talking about, but Easter was just the Sunday past, so spring, I guess? Well, either way, everything is still frozen, and days of constant heavy rain falling on that frozen ground is just running off into the already swollen creeks and rivers everywhere. The roll call of cities hit by the flood could go on. Dayton is generally recognized as the hardest hit because they were just simply devastated. There, the rising waters were causing furnaces to explode, so they were getting flood and fire. Ugh. In Elyria, the damage was largely relegated to stuff. The old dam behind the white mill was wiped out and would need rebuilding. This is the third time for that thing. When it went, it took with it large portions of the white mill too. These are some of the old insurance maps, and it looks like they took the opportunity to upgrade things a little bit. The East Bridge itself was largely fine, I think because of that single arch thing, but the railroad bridge behind it was going to need quite a bit of work. By then, the railroad was a big deal, and this bridge was pretty important. The Red Mill and their power plant also suffered severe damage when their dam at the top of the falls gave way too, but no lives were lost, which is actually surprising seeing as everyone seems to have come out to watch the Washington Avenue Bridge go down. They would rebuild, in many ways for the better. Here you can see they upgraded to the single arch style bridge work. And there were improvements everywhere. This is from before the flood. From here, you're looking north on East Bridge Street across the bridge itself. See the train crossing the road at ground level? Well, I took this last year standing in about the same spot, and the whole thing goes over the road now. And not just here, they raised everything. They kept going until they lifted all of the train tracks all over town. I'm thinking the flood was a bit of a wake-up call. I don't know if you noticed the Red Mill rising up behind the new bridge there, but it was rebuilt too. It would produce flour for another 25 years, but the electric generator at the bottom of the falls there would never really amount to much after that. Somewhere before World War II, the Ohio Public Service Company buys the property and quietly dismantles everything. Anymore, the only evidence anything was even here is that there's clearly a dam still sitting on top of the East Falls, and if you look way down below the wooden structure of the Riverwalk, you can kind of sort of spot whatever is left of the old generator plant from the Elyria milling and power days. By 1930, Riverside Milling was wrapping things up too over at the White Mill and officially dissolved their corporation. The property was bought by a real estate company who found a guy looking for a new start on his life and decided he wanted to try his hand at being a miller. He fired up the old mill and even offered the old brand Crescent flour, but I don't think he's in business even a year. And that's the last hurrah for the old white mill. After that, it just kind of sits there. In 1956, without fanfare, the dying ember of an eyesore that was potentially the oldest structure in town was torn down. Baker Auto used the space as their second lot and would pretty early on share their new building with a small auto glass shop specializing in dealer repair and services. Eventually, Al's Auto Glass and Carm's Radiators would take over the rest of the building too. That's my grandpa hanging around in the back there smoking cigarettes and supervising. I kind of know that pose. He would retire and Carm would take over, eventually giving it to his son Gary, who seems to have run the business quite successfully for a number of years. And now it's a brewery. About a decade ago, there was a small movement to recreate the Red Mill up at the Falls and do a pioneer village around it. Like I said, iconic, but that really never materialized. Now that space is pretty much a parking lot. A few years later, in celebration of the 200th anniversary of the city's founding, a plaque was installed across from where Heman's house used to be, which is also a parking lot. There was a dedication ceremony and everything. And the whole thing took place about a block up the street from my grandpa's shop, which is not and never has been a parking lot, but continues to find new and interesting ways to contribute to the neighborhood. Next time, we're going to try and figure out which one of my uncles did that. Yikes. Where we all used to live.
You did what you wanted, suffice to leave. The trail of breadcrumb, but I can see your cup is still half full. When I want to grow, when I go it alone, I can't believe the way my mind takes on